The night sky over the Persian Gulf hung thick and dark, a blanket of black that seemed to swallow everything within it. At Shahid Dastgab Air Base in southern Iran, the radar operators sat hunched over their glowing screens, eyes fixed on the green pixelated landscape that stretched across their monitors. It was 0200 hours, the dead of night when most of the world slept, but for these men, sleep was a luxury they could not afford. Their job was to see the unseen, to detect the approach of aircraft long before they could be heard or witnessed by the naked eye. It was a responsibility that weighed heavily on their shoulders, a burden they carried with the knowledge that any mistake could have catastrophic consequences for their nation. The night shift supervisor, Colonel Reza Ahmadi, was a veteran of 23 years in the Iranian Air Defense Command. He had seen conflicts come and go, had experienced the technical arms race that characterized modern military operations, and had always prided himself on the vigilance of his unit. His team was composed of the best radar operators in the entire Iranian military, men who had trained for years to detect even the most sophisticated military aircraft. Yet tonight, something felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that Ahmadi could sense even if he couldn't quite articulate it. He walked among the banks of monitors, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, his eyes from screen to screen with practiced efficiency. "Status report," Ahmadi commanded, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the equipment that filled the operations center. The younger operators quickly snapped to attention, their fingers flying across keyboards and their voices overlapping as they reported the data streaming in from the various radar installations scattered across Iranian territory. The skies, it seemed, were clear. No contacts, no returns that indicated aircraft movement. The Persian Gulf had been quiet for weeks now, and there was a sense among the lower-ranking personnel that tonight would be no different from any other night. But Ahmadi knew better. He had been in this business long enough to understand that in military operations, silence was often the prelude to something significant. Across the Persian Gulf, nearly 200 miles to the east, the American military was executing a mission of extraordinary sophistication and strategic importance. At an undisclosed location, 4 F-35 Lightning II stealth fighters sat on the runway, their pilot performing pre-flight checks with the precision of surgeons preparing for a critical operation. These were not ordinary aircraft. The F-35, with its distinctive angular design and radar-absorbing composite materials, represented the cutting edge of modern military aviation technology. It was a platform that had cost billions of dollars to develop, had encountered years of technical challenges and cost overruns, and yet now stood as the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, capable of operations that would have been considered science fiction just 2 decades earlier. The pilots of these aircraft were the elite of the elite. Each one had logged thousands of hours in the air, had trained extensively in stealth operations, and had been selected for this particular mission because of their exceptional skills and their ability to perform under extreme pressure. Squadron leader Marcus "Ghost" Thompson was the mission commander, a pilot who had earned his call sign not because of any supernatural qualities, because of his uncanny ability to complete missions while leaving behind virtually no trace of his presence. He stood in the pre-flight briefing room, his flight suit bearing the insignia of the United States Air Force, and his expression was one of absolute focus and determination. Around him, his wingman reviewed the mission parameters one more time, absorbing every detail, every waypoint, every contingency that had been planned by the strategic operations team. The mission itself was codenamed Operation Shadow Veil, and its objective was to penetrate deep into Iranian airspace, overfly sensitive military installations, conduct electronic reconnaissance of their air defense systems, and return to base without detection. It was a mission designed to accomplish several goals simultaneously: to gather intelligence on Iranian military capabilities, to demonstrate the technological superiority of American military systems, and to send a clear message to the Iranian government about the vulnerability of their airspace and the limitations of their defensive capabilities. The strategic calculus behind such a mission was complex and multifaceted, involving considerations of geopolitical posturing, military modernization, and the ongoing tension between the United States and Iran in the region. As the F-35 pilots made their way to their aircraft, they moved with the quiet confidence of men who knew they possessed a significant technological advantage. The stealth capabilities of their aircraft had been tested extensively, had been proven in actual combat scenarios, and had consistently demonstrated an ability to penetrate heavily defended airspace without detection. The Iranian air defense system, while formidable on paper, was primarily composed of Russian-supplied systems that, while advanced, were not specifically designed to counter fifth-generation stealth aircraft. This was the asymmetry that the American military intended to exploit, the technological edge that would allow them to operate with virtual impunity within Iranian airspace. The night was moonless, and the stars provided scant illumination as the four F-35s lined up on the runway. The pilots completed their final communications checks, confirmed their navigation waypoints, and verified their sensor packages. In the lead aircraft, Squadron Leader Thompson ran through the checklist one final time, his hands moving with practiced precision across the controls and switches of the advanced cockpit. Everything checked out. Systems were nominal. Fuel loads were optimal. The navigation systems had been triple-checked, and the route had been programmed into the aircraft's sophisticated computer system. Everything was ready. Thompson looked to his right and made eye contact with his wingman, giving a slight nod that indicated they were prepared to proceed. The tower cleared them for takeoff, and the four fighters rolled forward down the runway, their engines at full military power. Within seconds, they were airborne, their noses pointed toward Iranian airspace, their wings already trimmed for the long cruise flight that would take them deep into enemy territory. As they climbed through the night sky, gaining altitude with each passing moment, the aircraft began their transition into the stealth profile that would characterize the entire mission. All external lights were extinguished except for those absolutely necessary for flight safety. The aircraft's radar signature began to morph and change, compressed into a profile so small that to Iranian radar, detecting them would be like trying to spot a sparrow among a flock of eagles. Back Shahid Daskab Airbase, Colonel Ahmadi was beginning to feel the weight of his years. He had been on duty for 14 hours straight, and the monotony of the empty radar screens was starting to wear on him. There had been no activity to speak of, no aircraft movements of significance, nothing that would suggest that anything unusual was occurring in his sector of responsibility. He was just contemplating whether he should check on the night watch rotation schedule when something caught his eye. It was subtle, barely a whisper on the radar screen, a momentary reflection that appeared and then vanished like a ghost flickering across the green display. Ahmadi leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he stared intently at the screen where he had seen the anomaly. "Did anyone else catch that?" he asked, his voice sharp and alert, all traces of fatigue suddenly banished from his demeanor. The radar operators around him quickly checked their own stations, their eyes scanning their displays for any indication of what Ahmadi had observed. For several seconds there was nothing, just the normal background noise and occasional false returns that were inherent to all radar systems. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, another target flickered across the screen, even fainter than the first, almost like a ghost returning from the dead. "Sir, I'm seeing something on my scope," one of the younger operators called out, his voice betraying a note of uncertainty. "It's very faint, almost subliminal. I initially thought it was a system artifact, but it keeps reappearing in a specific pattern." The operator's name was Lieutenant Karim Sadegh, and he had less than 2 years of experience with the Iranian air defense system. His instincts, however, were good, and his training had been thorough. Ahmadi moved quickly to Sadegh's station and bent over the younger man's shoulder, studying the radar returns with the intensity of a man who suddenly realized that the night might not be as quiet as he had initially believed. "Are we getting any other confirmations?" Ahmadi asked, his mind already beginning to process the implications of what he was observing. If there were aircraft in Iranian airspace, even stealthy ones, they should be detectable by the overlapping coverage provided by multiple radar installations. He reached for the telephone that connected his operations center to the other air defense command posts scattered throughout Iranian territory. Within seconds, he had regional coordinators on the line, asking the same questions, seeking confirmation of the unusual radar returns that were now becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. As the F-35s pressed deeper into Iranian airspace, their pilots were acutely aware of the fact that they were beginning to probe the outer fringes of the Iranian air defense network. The aircraft's electronic warfare systems were gathering detailed information about the radiation patterns emanating from Iranian radar installation, mapping the locations and characteristics of their defensive network with precise accuracy. Every kilometer of penetration, every degree of course change, every altitude adjustment was adding to the intelligence picture being built by the American military. The pilots, however, remained focused on the immediate tactical situation, monitoring their systems, adjusting their heading and altitude as required, and maintaining the stealth posture that was the cornerstone of their operational security. The radar room at Shahid Daskab was beginning to buzz with activity. Ahmadi had called in additional personnel, had activated additional radar assets, and had begun the process of attempting to correlate the faint and intermittent radar returns that seemed to be moving through Iranian airspace with an almost deliberately evasive pattern. Multiple radar operators were now hunched over their screens, comparing notes, suggesting theories, eyes, all while Colonel Ahmadi stood in the center of the room, his face growing increasingly stern as he came to grips with the reality of the situation. Somewhere in the night sky above Iran, there were aircraft that were attempting to evade detection. Aircraft that, by all the indicators at his disposal, should not have been able to penetrate this far into Iranian territory without triggering more definitive alarms. "Get me the commander of air defense operations," Ahmadi commanded, his now carrying an edge of urgency that had not been present earlier, "and initiate alert status 2 for all interceptor units in the southern sector. I want F-14 Tomcats scrambled from Bandar Abbas Air Base within the next 5 minutes." The orders began to cascade through the chain of command. The routine rhythm of the night watch suddenly transformed into a state of heightened alert and military readiness. Throughout the southern section of Iran, air defense personnel were snapping to attention, scrambling into action, understanding that something significant was unfolding in the darkness above their homeland. The transformation at the Iranian Air Defense Headquarters was nothing short of remarkable. Within minutes, what had been a sleepy night watch station transformed into a beehive of activity. Phones were ringing, officers were shouting orders, and the normally calm and controlled atmosphere of the operations center was replaced by something far more chaotic and urgent. At Bandar Abbas Air Base, pilots were being roused from their readiness alert, were being rushed to their aircraft, and were being prepared for an emergency scramble that would put them in the air within minutes. The crews worked with practiced efficiency, understanding that time was critical and that every second counted in the race to identify and potentially intercept the mysterious aircraft that seemed to be penetrating deeper into Iranian airspace with each passing moment. The American pilots, meanwhile, were operating in what they considered to be an environment of almost surreal calm. Their aircraft sensor systems were providing them with constant updates on the status of Iranian air defenses, alerting them to the activation of radar stations, the startup of air defense systems, and the preparation of interceptor aircraft. What the American military had discovered through years of surveillance and intelligence gathering was that the Iranian air defense system, while extensive and reasonably sophisticated, had significant blind spots and vulnerability. The F-35's advanced sensor systems were identifying and exploiting these weaknesses with precise accuracy, guiding the aircraft through corridors of relatively diminished radar coverage, taking them through gaps in the defensive network that the Iranian military had not fully appreciated existed. Back in the operations center at Shahid Dasgaib, Colonel Ahmadi was now in communication with the highest levels of Iranian military command. Reports of the unidentified aircraft were transmitted up the chain of command with increasing urgency, accompanied by the growing realization that whatever was happening in Iranian airspace was something of significant strategic importance. The radar operators had now achieved a level of resolution that allowed them to determine that there were multiple aircraft involved, that they were flying in a formation pattern consistent with military strike or reconnaissance mission, and that they were proceeding along a vector that appeared to be directed toward some of the most sensitive military installations in southern Iran. The F-14 Tomcats that had been scrambled from Bandar Abbas were now in the air, their crews frantically searching for visual contact with the unidentified aircraft. Despite being equipped with their own radar systems, the Tomcats were finding it extraordinarily difficult to establish and maintain a lock on the American stealth fighters. The radar returns from the F-35s remained faint and intermittent, appearing and then vanishing from radar screens as the American aircraft continued their sophisticated evasion tactics. The F-14 pilots were experienced and well-trained, but they were flying an aircraft that had entered service in the 1970s, an aircraft that, while still capable and formidable, was fundamentally designed to counter aircraft from a different era of military aviation. Against fifth-generation stealth fighters, they were significantly outmatched, and the pilots were beginning to understand this grim reality with increasing clarity. The tension in the American operations center coordinating the mission was building with each passing minute. The commander watched the real-time data streaming in from the F-35s, saw the activation of Iranian interceptor aircraft, understood that the mission was entering a critical phase where the stealth advantage of the American aircraft was being tested against the mobilizing resources of the Iranian military. What the Iranian military possessed in terms of numbers and determination, however, they lacked in terms of the technological sophistication required to effectively counter a fifth-generation stealth aircraft. The F-35s were providing constant information about the location, heading, and capabilities of the Iranian aircraft attempting to intercept them, information that was being fed back to American air defense and warning systems with real-time precision. At the operations center in Tehran, Tehran, where some of Iran's most senior military officials had been summoned to monitor the situation. There was a growing sense of alarm and frustration. The military had been receiving conflicting reports, some suggesting that the unidentified aircraft were a significant threat, others indicating that they might be false echoes or sensor artifacts. But the evidence was accumulating, the data was becoming increasingly coherent, and the realization was dawning on Iranian military leadership that their airspace was being violated by a military force whose technological capabilities far exceeded their initial assumptions. The implications of this situation were staggering. If American aircraft could penetrate Iranian airspace this easily, could evade their air defense systems this completely, then the vulnerability of Iranian military installations, and potentially the Iranian homeland itself, was far greater than previously understood. The F-35s continued their mission with mechanical precision, their pilots maintaining the exact course and altitude that had been programmed into their flight computers. The aircraft were now overflying some of the most sensitive military installations in Iran, their sensor systems recording data on air defense deployments, command and control facilities, and weapons storage areas. Every piece of information gathered during this mission would be analyzed, studied, and incorporated into American military plans for potential future operations. The mission was proceeding with textbook precision, the stealth technology performing exactly as designed, the Iranian military struggling to respond to a threat they could barely perceive, let alone effectively counter. The frustration at the Iranian Air Defense Command Center was almost palpable. Ahmadi was receiving report after report of faint radar contacts that seemed to be moving through the Iranian air defense network with almost contemptuous ease. The Iranian interceptor aircraft were being vectored toward the general area where the American fighters were believed to be located, but the pilots were unable to establish visual contact or achieve reliable radar locks. The American aircraft seemed to be operating in a different dimension entirely, a realm where conventional air defense tactics held little relevance. This realization was beginning to percolate through the Iranian military command structure, and with it came an uncomfortable acknowledgement that the technological gap between the American military and the Iranian military had perhaps grown wider than anyone had been willing to admit. Suddenly, one of the radar operators let out a startled cry. For a brief moment, lasting no more than 2 or 3 seconds, one of the radar screens had shown a clear and unmistakable radar return. The image was sharp, the target signature was definitive, and there was no question whatsoever about what the operators were seeing. It was an aircraft, a fighter aircraft, moving at supersonic speed, displaying characteristics consistent with the most advanced American military platforms. The image flickered once, twice, and then it was gone, vanished from the screen, as if it had never existed. But those few seconds of clear contact had provided the Iranian military with something they had not possessed before: concrete confirmation that American military aircraft were indeed operating in Iranian airspace. The F-35 pilot, who had briefly appeared on the Iranian radar scope, had done so intentionally. A calculated maneuver designed to confirm for the Iranian military that the threat they were detecting was real and present. It was a form of psychological warfare, a demonstration of capability, an intent designed to send a message to the Iranian leadership that their airspace was not secure, their defenses were inadequate, and that the American military possessed the technological and operational capabilities to conduct whatever operations it deemed necessary within an Iranian territory. The pilot knew that this brief exposure to radar would be followed by a return to the stealth posture that had characterized the first part of the mission. But in those crucial seconds of contact, a message had been sent that would reverberate through the corridors of Iranian military and political leadership. The report of the clear radar contact sent shockwaves through the Iranian command structure. If a radar operator at Shahid Dastgab could see the aircraft that clearly, even if only for a few seconds, then the aircraft had to be real. The question that now gripped the minds of Iranian military planners was not whether the aircraft existed, but what they were doing here, how many there were, and most critically, what their intentions were. The possibility that this could be a prelude to a broader military attack was too terrible to contemplate, yet it was a possibility that had to be considered in light of the current geopolitical tensions between the United States and Iran. As the F-35s began their egress from Iranian airspace, their pilots initiated a series of maneuvers designed to evade the interceptor aircraft that were attempting to establish contact. The stealth fighters climbed rapidly, their engines at full military power, their course vectors designed to exploit the blind spots and vulnerabilities in the Iranian air defense network that their sensor systems had so carefully mapped over the course of the mission. Within minutes, the American American aircraft had retreated to international airspace, their mission completed, their objective accomplished. The Iranian interceptor aircraft, flying as hard and fast as their engines would allow, were unable to establish any form of contact with the American stealth fighters. By the time the F-14 Tomcats reached the area where they had last received vector updates for the unidentified aircraft, there was nothing there but empty sky. The F-35 formation rendezvous with an airborne tanker that had been positioned well outside Iranian airspace, where the fighters topped off their fuel tanks and began the cruise flight back to their home base. The pilots were in a state of heightened awareness, their senses still sharp from the adrenaline of the mission, their minds replaying the events of the last hour and processing the reality of what they had accomplished. They had penetrated deep into Iranian airspace, had conducted extensive reconnaissance, had flown over highly sensitive military installations, and had returned to friendly airspace without sustaining any damage or encountering any significant threats. The mission had been a complete success, a demonstration of technological superiority that would send a clear message to the Iranian military and political leadership about the balance of military power in the region. Back at Shahid Dasgaib Air Base, Colonel Ahmadi stood in the operations center, staring at the now empty radar screens that had been such a source of concern just minutes before. The American aircraft were gone, withdrawn from Iranian airspace as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving behind nothing but questions and a growing sense of national anxiety. The immediate threat passed, but the psychological and strategic implications of what had occurred were far from resolved. Ahmadi began the process of compiling reports, documenting every radar return, every vector, every piece of data that could be salvaged from the night's events. These reports would make their way up the chain of command, would be analyzed by military planners, would be discussed in the highest levels of Iranian government, and with each retelling, the significance of the American incursion would grow, the implications becoming increasingly profound. The news of the American fighter jets penetrating Iranian airspace reached the offices of senior government officials within hours. Military commanders convened emergency meetings. Analysts began the work of determining exactly what had been overflown and why, and the Iranian military began the process of assessing the vulnerabilities that had been so dramatically exposed by the American operation. The realization was beginning to set in that Iranian air defenses, which had been considered reasonably robust and modern, were fundamentally inadequate against the technological capabilities that the American military had brought to bear. This understanding carried with it enormous implications for Iranian military doctrine, defense planning, and the broader strategic situation in the Persian Gulf region. In Washington, the operation was being hailed as a major success. Senior military officials and political leaders were briefed on the details of the mission, on the quality of intelligence that had been gathered, and on the successful execution of a complex and dangerous military operation. The mission had accomplished exactly what it was designed to accomplish. It had demonstrated American military superiority, it had gathered valuable intelligence on Iranian air defense capabilities, and it had sent a clear and unmistakable message to the Iranian leadership about the vulnerability of Iranian airspace and the limitations of Iranian defensive capabilities. The political and strategic value of the operation extended far beyond the immediate tactical success of the mission itself. The Iranian military leadership, meanwhile, was grappling with the humiliating reality of what had transpired. American fighters had flown through their airspace, had evaded their air defenses, had overflown sensitive military installations, and had escaped without encountering any meaningful resistance. This was not just a military failure. It was a catastrophic demonstration of Iranian military inadequacy. Emergency meetings were convened with military planners, strategic analysts, and defense officials. The question that dominated these discussions was painfully simple. What had to be done to prevent a similar incursion in the future? The answer was equally simple and equally problematic. In the short term, almost nothing could be done. The gap between Iranian air defense technology and American stealth aircraft was simply too vast to be bridged through any quick fix or emergency response. In the longer term, Iran would need to either acquire or develop air defense systems capable of countering fifth-generation stealth aircraft, a project that would take years and require financial resources that were in short supply. Throughout the region, the news of the American incursion rippled across the geopolitical landscape like a stone dropped into a still pond. In Israel, military planners took careful note of the operation, understanding that if American aircraft could penetrate Iranian airspace so easily, then Israeli aircraft could do the same. In Europe, analysts studied the reports of the operation, recognizing the strategic implications for their understanding understanding of military balance in the Middle East. In Russia, officials watched with concern as the United States demonstrated the capabilities of its fifth-generation stealth aircraft, a demonstration that implied significant limitations in their own air defense systems should they ever be called upon to confront American aircraft in a future conflict. The incident that had begun in the darkness of a Persian Gulf night with the faint flicker of a radar return on a green screen had evolved into an international incident with profound strategic implications. The American military had sent a message that transcended words. It had demonstrated through the most dramatic of means possible that in the modern era of military competition, technological superiority could convey military advantage to a degree that was almost overwhelming. The F-35 fighters that had flown through Iranian airspace had carried with them more than just advanced weaponry and sophisticated sensors. They had carried with them an implicit message about the nature of modern military power, about the dangers of falling behind in the technological competition that defines modern military affairs, and about the stark reality that in the contemporary global security environment, there are winners and losers in the race for military technological superiority. For Colonel Ahmadi and the radar operators Shahid Dasgaib Air Base, the night would not soon be forgotten. They had witnessed something extraordinary, something that challenged fundamental assumptions about their capability to defend their homeland. In the years to come, this night would be referenced in military academies, would be studied in defense colleges, and would serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing technology to fall too far behind the capabilities of potential adversaries. The night when American fighters slipped through Iranian airspace unseen had demonstrated, in the most concrete and undeniable of terms, the vast military technological gulf that separated the American military from the military of Iran. In that realization lay both a warning and a lesson. A warning about the consequences of falling behind in the technological competition that characterizes modern military affairs, and a lesson about the realities of power politics in the 21st century. As dawn broke over the Persian Gulf and the sun began its journey across the sky, the military machines stood down from their heightened state of alert. The F-35s were already returning to their home base, their pilots decompressing from the intensity of the mission, their maintenance crews preparing the aircraft for the next operational tasking. In Iranian air defense command centers, officers were filing reports, military planners were beginning the process of assessing the implications of what had occurred, and government officials were grappling with the political and strategic fallout from the incursion. The incident had passed, but its consequences would reverberate for months and years to come. The night when the American fighters had breached Iranian airspace unseen had marked a turning point in the strategic balance of power in the region, a moment when technological superiority had been demonstrated with such force and clarity that no one could possibly have failed to understand its implications. The message had been sent, the message had been received, and the world had taken note.